The assembly rooms at Bath were the cruelest kind of beautiful that winter evening in January of 1814. All warm candlelight and the smell of beeswax, the orchestra threading something bright and danceable through the smoke, the chandeliers pulling fire out of every diamond in the room. Cecily Hargrove stood at the edge of the entrance hall and felt the cold that had followed her in from the street settle into her chest, where it made a home and stayed. She had been invited. That was the first thing to remember. Mrs. Hedris. Penhaligon had been deliberate and kind about it, pressing the card into Cecily's hand with a particular firmness that said she was not to refuse, that there were friends still, that Bath was not London. The 2 years and a deed of separation and a private act of Parliament need not mean the same thing here as they had meant there. Cecily had accepted. She had taken the better of her 2 evening gowns, the cream muslin with the bronze ribbon that she had retrimmed herself the previous autumn, and she had dressed without ceremony and come. The room knew her before she had crossed the first threshold. She saw it happen, the way she always saw it happen now. That precise rearrangement of expression on a face that had not expected to encounter her. The small, controlled pivot, the too brief greeting. Lady Cresswell with her fan at a precise angle turning to speak to the woman at her elbow. A younger girl she did not recognize leaning close to a chaperone for a whispered word. The chaperone's gaze sliding away again quickly. The machinery of it was so smooth by now that Cecily could almost admire it. She crossed the room to find Mrs. Penhaligon. She did not see him at first. She did not notice the man standing near the far window who had gone, still in a way that was not quite stillness. A man who had been in motion toward the refreshments table and had stopped, not abruptly, not with any visible cause, simply with the quality of a man who has seen something unexpected and is choosing, deliberately, how to respond to it. His name was Sir Edmund Vance. He was 34 years old, and a physician of considerable reputation in London circles, attending the Bath winter, for reasons that were partly professional and partly the kind of purposeless movement a widower falls into when the rooms he occupies at home have become too familiar. He held the glass he was no longer intending to drink from. At the far end of the room, where the silk draperies were greenest, stood Lady Alderton. She was 60, or near enough, a handsome woman of the kind the years treat as an argument for their own authority, more certain it seemed, the longer she had been given to be certain in. She wore rubies at her throat and a pale blue gown, and she stood with her son at her elbow, Sir Gerald Alderton, whose broad face held the fixed cordiality of a man who has learned to perform ease. Beside him stood a young woman in white, very fair, very poised, with diamonds at her ears and the name, Cecily would later learn, of Miss Lavinia Rowe. Cecily registered Lady Alderton's presence before Lady Alderton registered hers. That small and only advantage. She steadied her breathing and continued toward Mrs. Penhaligon. She did not hear what Lady Alderton said to the woman beside her, low and precise, with the fan not quite closed and the gaze directed with surgical accuracy across the room. She did not hear the words, "The barren wife, my son did what any man of rank must." She did not need to hear them. She could read, from the posture of the woman who received them, the shape of the sentence clearly enough. Sir Edmund Vance heard. He was close enough. He heard, and the glass in his hand grew heavier. He had, in the last 6 minutes, told himself twice that he was under no obligation whatsoever, that the records were sealed by professional discretion, that the proper course had always been silence. He told himself a 3rd time and believed himself less. Cecily reached Mrs. Penhaligon's side. She smiled. She accepted a glass of warm negus and stood in the warmth of the room and felt the cold in her chest shift and resettle, and did not look again toward the far end where Lady Alderton stood with her diamonds and her son, and the young woman who was to give the Alderton name the heir that Cecily, by public record, had failed to provide. She had been 19 when her father arranged the marriage. She had thought then, not with any great romanticism, not with any particular idealism. She had been practical and clear-eyed about it, and she had thought that he was a man of decent standing who would provide a stable household, and that she would manage it well, and that children would come in time. She had thought those things, with the measured certainty of a young woman who has been taught that a steady match well managed is the best a woman of her position can expect, and she had been, for a year or perhaps a little longer, nearly right. They had not argued exactly. That was the thing people did not understand when they looked at her with that particular species of pity or judgment. There had been no dramatic rupture. There had been a lengthening silence, room by room, season by season, 3 years of it, and a physician's visit she was not told about, and then a second one she was told about, and then the conversation in Gerald's study in the summer of her 22nd year. Gerald standing at the window and speaking to the glass rather than to her, using words she had not been educated to understand clinically, but that she understood in their practical register with perfect clarity. There was a deficiency. She was the deficiency. He was sorry. He had a duty to his line. The deed of separation had been. Lady Alderton informed her with a courtesy that was the most painful thing Cecily had ever witnessed in an adult human face, for the benefit of all concerned. Cecily had been returned to her father's house. Her father now 62 and declining. The estate small and the income smaller. Her father died the following winter, leaving her the house in trust, until her cousin came of age, and then the house was not hers either. She came to Bath with 2 trunks and a small quarterly income from the trust, and her Aunt Marjorie's spare room, and everything that used to be her life packed into a thing she did not look at directly. The charge of barrenness had not been stated in legal language. It had been implied with such fine-cut social precision that legal language would have been less effective. She was the divorced woman. She was the woman who had not given the Alderton name and heir. She was, in 3 words spoken in drawing rooms across 2 seasons, the barren wife. She had not cried. She had not raged. She had come to Bath and learned to read the room before she entered it, and learned to find her friends carefully and to hold them. She had not thought herself pitied, particularly. She had thought herself simply legible to any given room before she had spoken a single word. She had not thought about him at all because she did not know he existed. And she would not have imagined that a physician in Bath for the winter carried in the breast pocket of his coat a small leather notebook that contained 3 pages of clinical notation that could undo the thing that had been done to her. She found out his name from Mrs. Penhaligon on the 2nd Tuesday of that month, when she arrived at Mrs. Bettish, Penhaligon's sitting room for a regular morning call, and found him already there, sitting across from the fire with a cup of tea growing cold at his elbow, talking to Mrs. Trebb, Penhaligon about a patient they had in common, and stopping with a particular quality of attention. When Cecily came in, Mrs. Penhaligon introduced them. He rose, which men of his age and station often did not do with women who had been divorced. She noticed this. She filed it in the part of her mind that had grown expert at sorting evidence. "Miss Hargrove," he said. Not with the adjusted warmth some people used, the worn-tone compensation that was its own kind of acknowledgment of what she had been. He said it plainly, as though it were simply her name. Which it was. "Sir Edmund," she said. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, in a manner that suggested it had done so early, a face that was angular and quiet, and eyes that she noticed were looking at her, not the way physicians look at patients, and not the way men of his class looked at women of her reduced station, but the way she thought later. A person looks at something they are deciding. He did not make it obvious. It was there, and then it was not there. And he returned his attention to Mrs. Penhaligon and asked a practical question about the patient they had been discussing. He called twice more that fortnight, once when she was present, once when she was not, and returned to find he had left a card with a footnote that was perhaps professional and perhaps not. She read it 3 times, and could not determine which. She saw him at the lending library on a Thursday afternoon in the 2nd week of February when the light was very pale and long through the east windows, and she had gone in to return a volume of natural philosophy she had borrowed on behalf of her aunt. He was at the back of the room, standing before the science section with a small notebook open in his hand, making notes with a practiced economy of movement that suggested the notebook was habitual and the habit was old. He did not see her come in. She went to the counter, returned her aunt's volume, and was collecting her gloves when she noticed on the shelf nearest the window A card misplaced in the wrong section, a reader's lending card tucked between volumes of poetry, rather than the natural history shelf it was labeled for. She saw it the way she saw most things in the years since Bath had been her home, as something small and wrong and quietly fixable. She pulled it out. She crossed to the correct section, located the appropriate place, and slid it back without making a production of it. She was turning back toward the door when she realized he was watching. He was not pretending to read. He was simply standing with his notebook in his hand and watching her with an expression she could not name at first. Something grave and without performance, something that had the quality of conclusion in it. He said nothing. She said nothing. She put on her gloves and left. She thought about it afterward longer than was sensible. The expression was not pity, it was not desire. Exactly, or not only. It was the look of a man who has been deliberating something for some time, and has just been given the last piece of information he required. She did not know what she had given him. She did not know that what he had seen was the thing he had been waiting to see since the assembly rooms. A woman who repaired quietly and claimed nothing. She did not know what he carried. If you have stayed this far in the story, you know already what kind of woman Cecily is. Stay a little longer. The notes exist. What happens next is the thing the season had been building toward since that January evening, and the mathematics of it will not resolve without the physician. Edmund's wife had been called Anne. She had died in the autumn of 1811, of a childbed fever that announced itself on the third day and finished its work on the fifth, and Edmund had stood at the foot of her bed on the fourth day and understood for the first time what it was to possess a great deal of medical knowledge and watch it matter not at all. The child, a boy, did not survive the week. He had spent the 2 years since with the particular efficiency of a man who has made grief into industry, attending patients across 3 counties, building a reputation that was now formidable, and coming to Bath in January of 1814 for no better reason than that his colleague Dr. Pemberton had asked him, and the rooms at home in London had seemed of late to hold a silence of a specific quality that he found he could not continue to occupy alone. He had attended Sir Gerald in the spring of 1811. This was in the ordinary rotation of a busy London practice. Not in the ordinary rotation of such a practice. Unusual. Sir Gerald had come to him by way of a referral, presenting with concerns that were, in Edmund's professional experience, not uncommon in men of a certain age and constitution, and Edmund had conducted an examination and arrived at conclusions he had recorded, as was his practice in the small leather notebook that lived in the breast pocket of his coat. 3 pages of notation. Clinical, precise, unambiguous. Edmund had advised Alderton on the matter with a directness his patients generally valued, and Alderton had received the information with a silence that went on slightly too long, and then asked about confidentiality with a precision that told Edmund, at once, that the information was going to be used in a particular way. He had said nothing, because professional discretion was professional discretion, because the marriage was not his to comment upon, because he had told himself, and he had believed himself, which was the thing he had to live with, that the record existed and would exist, and that was sufficient. He had told himself this in the spring of 1811, and the summer and the autumn when Anne died. And he had not thought about Alderton again. He had told himself this in the winter of 1812, when a colleague mentioned the Alderton separation, with the particular intonation that meant there was a woman who had come out of it badly. He had told himself this in 1813 in the spring, when a dinner conversation referenced the divorced woman from the Alderton business, with the phrase, "barren, poor creature," in a voice that was lowered not from discretion, but from the particular satisfaction some people take in the word. He was still telling himself this when Cecily walked into the Bath assembly rooms and Lady Alderton arranged her expression and said, low and precise, "The barren wife, my son did what any man of rank must." He had 3 pages of notes in his breast pocket. He had been telling himself things about them for 3 years. He walked home that night through streets that were very cold and very bright with frost, and he did not permit himself to think about the notebook. He thought instead about the particular quality of her composure, not the composure of a woman who felt nothing, but the composure of a woman who had learned, through repetition, to contain what she felt with a precision that was its own kind of grief. He had seen it in patients. He had seen it in people who had been told something terrible about themselves and had chosen, because they had no alternative, to go on. He recognized it with the part of him that was a physician, and with the part of him that was not. He did not sleep particularly well. She did not know, across the month of February, that he was deciding something. She knew only that he came to Mrs. Tyre, Penhaligon's sitting room, and spoke to her with an attention that was different from what she was accustomed to receiving. Not the managed warmth of men who were determined to demonstrate their open-mindedness about her situation, and not the cool correctness of those who found the situation simply irregular. He spoke to her as though she were possessed of a mind he was interested in, which was rarer than she could account for. He asked her once about the volume of natural philosophy she had returned for her aunt, and the question was not perfunctory. She was careful. She had learned to be careful in the months after Bath began to know her, had learned the cost of assuming anything. She did not allow herself to think about the expression in the lending library. She did not allow herself to catalogue the moments of his particular attention with anything that resembled hope, because hope was a thing she had, gradually, methodically, put away. She was managing this successfully until the last day of February, when she arrived at a small afternoon tea. Mrs. Penhaligon had arranged and found that Lady Alderton was also present. It was not malicious. On Mrs. Penhaligon's part, Mrs. Penhaligon was one of those good-natured women who believe that proximity is its own solution, and that people who avoid each other have simply not been given the opportunity for understanding. She had perhaps not considered the precise social geometry of the room. She had perhaps not considered that Lady Alderton would require, within 20 minutes of the gathering, to address the assembled company on the subject of the forthcoming announcement of her son's engagement to Miss Lavinia Rowe, with its attendant implication of the Alderton line's imminent security, with its attendant implication of everything that had been lacking previously. Cecily was in the room when this was said. She had a cup of tea in her hand, and she kept it level. The room's attention moved across her, with the efficiency of a gaze that does not mean to land and lands anyway. She heard someone, not Lady Alderton, not anyone in the direct party, but a woman 2 seats away, lean toward her companion and repeat something that had clearly been said more than once before, in other rooms, the woman who failed him. She set the cup in the saucer without sound, and did not look at her hands. She saw Edmund across the room. He had come late and was standing near the door with the particular quality of a man who has arrived and immediately assessed the situation and has not yet decided what to do. His eyes found her. Whatever she had allowed herself to think in the lending library, she did not allow herself to think now. She looked away. 2 weeks later, the announcement of Sir Gerald's engagement to Miss Lavinia Rowe was published in the newspapers. The language was complimentary and warm. It did not reference Cecily by name. It did not need to. The structure of the sentence, the phrase long hoped for, did the work with the efficiency of Lady Alderton's own training. Cecily read it at breakfast in her aunt's sitting room, folded the paper, and went about her morning. She did not read it twice. She had been reading for 3 years the same sentence underneath every sentence that was formally printed about Sir Gerald, and she knew already the shape of the underneath this time, the long-awaited renewal of the Alderton line, the heir to be furnished by the correct woman. She did not cry. She had learned not to cry over things that could not be changed, which was not the same thing as not feeling them. The cold in her chest, her reliable companion, made itself slightly heavier, and she put on her good wool wrap and went out to walk along the parade, where the morning air was sharp and clean, and asked nothing of her. She returned an hour later, and found her aunt at the fire with her knitting, who looked at her over the top of her spectacles and said, "Walk do you good," with the economy of a woman who had long since stopped managing the details of others' grief, and had settled into the useful practice of warm fires and regular meals and not asking. Cecily sat down and took up her own work and was quietly, methodically, all right. Edmund came to Mrs. Penhaligon's that afternoon. Cecily was not there. She had declined sending a note that cited a slight cold, which was not precisely a lie, because the cold that lived in her chest had, since the newspaper, grown considerably. Edmund sat in Mrs. Enthery Penhaligon's sitting room for 20 minutes, and drank his tea and said little. And when he left, Mrs. Penhaligon observed privately that he had the look of a man who had made a decision and was now calculating the cost of it. The occasion Lady Alderton chose for the formal public celebration was the Assembly Rooms. She had the ear of the Master of Ceremonies, and the following Friday was arranged as a special subscription ball, at which the Alderton engagement would be formally acknowledged. It was the same room where the season had begun, the same chandeliers and beeswax smell, the same orchestra. Cecily received an invitation. She did not know, until she examined it more carefully, that it had arrived not from the Assembly Rooms generally, but from Edmund, who had spoken to Mrs. Penhaligon and arranged for her to receive it. She did not know when she held the card that this was deliberate. She thought it was another of Mrs. Penhaligon's good-natured geometries. She almost did not go. She went because she was Cecily Hargrove, and she had learned in 3 years of reduced circumstances that she would not be chased from a room she had a right to enter, and because she was tired of being careful, and because in the part of herself she did not inspect often. She wanted to see him once more before whatever was happening between her own hope and her own caution resolved itself into the more familiar of the two outcomes. The room was full when she arrived, fuller than it had been in January, which was saying something. The engagement announcement had drawn the better part of the winter season's contingent, and at the center of it stood Lady Alderton in ivory and onyx, and beside her Sir Gerald, who had grown in Cecily's estimation, slightly more constructed in his cordiality than he had been 3 years ago. And Miss Lavinia Rowe, in white satin, with diamonds that caught the light from every direction at once. Cecily stood at the edge of the entrance and thought about turning around. She had been inside the room perhaps 12 minutes when Lady Alderton, surrounded by a cluster of her particular acquaintance, said, in a voice calibrated to carry across the nearest 10 feet of assembled company, that she could not imagine why the Master of Ceremonies had not seen fit to manage the guest list with somewhat more discretion. That certain presences made the evening awkward for the family, and that one did feel for the divorced woman. Naturally one did, but these gatherings were for the celebration of appropriate things, and one could not invite the barren wife without it casting a particular shadow over what should be a joyful occasion. The silence after it was the kind that happens in crowds, when a precise number of people have heard something, and the rest are about to. Cecily was among those who had heard. She felt her spine straighten without her choosing it, the habituated composure responding before she could think. Her hands were at her sides. She was looking at the middle distance. He crossed the room in 4 strides. She saw him coming, and did not understand, for a full 3 seconds, what she was seeing. He was not hurrying. His face was composed in the way she had come to recognize as his face under pressure. That particular kind of stillness that was not coldness, and he was walking toward Lady Alderton with an exactitude of direction that the people between him and his destination registered and moved to accommodate. He stopped. He was standing at the approximate center of the room, between the group surrounding Lady Alderton and the space where Cecily stood, and he reached into the breast pocket of his coat. He produced a small notebook. Dark leather, much used. He opened it to a page near the middle. He said, in a voice that was entirely level and entirely audible, "I attended Sir Gerald Alderton in the spring of 1811. I have the notes from that examination here. I should have produced them sooner. I did not. That is a failing I intend to correct this evening." The room was very quiet. "The notes are mine. The fault was never hers." He said it looking at Lady Alderton. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. In the particular silence of the Bath Assembly Rooms on a subscription ball Friday, a room that had spent 3 years rendering its verdict on her those 9 words, carried to every corner without effort. Lady Alderton's fan held at its characteristic precise angle stilled. Sir Gerald's constructed cordiality underwent a visible restructuring. He was a man watching his own architecture come apart at a joint he had thought secure. Edmund held the notebook. He did not gesture with it. He simply held it open, the pages visible to those nearest him, and those nearest him were within reading distance of the clinical notation in Edmund's very legible hand. Archibald Pemberton, who had arrived some time before, and had positioned himself with a precision that Cecily had not then understood, stepped forward. He was 63, a man of unimpeachable reputation in the medical community, and a former president of the Medical Society of London, and he said, in his own quiet register, "I can confirm the substance of those notes. I reviewed them at Sir Edmund's request this week." He nodded once to no one in particular and stepped back. Lady Alderton said, "This is," and stopped. The sentence did not find its continuation. It was the first time Cecily had ever seen her lose a sentence. The crowd's attention had a texture now. She felt it shift. She had spent 3 years on the wrong side of a crowd's attention, and she knew every register of it, and what she felt now was different from all of them. A kind of collective recognition, an adjustment of something fundamental, many small faces rearranging into new configurations. Place. Cecily stood where she was. She was looking at Edmund. He had turned from Lady Alderton, and he was looking at her, just as he had looked at her in the lending library. With that same expression, she had not been able to name the one that had the quality of conclusion in it, and she understood now what it was. It was a man who had deliberated something for a long time, and was no longer deliberating. He crossed the remaining distance between them. "Miss Hargrove," he said. His voice was low now, for her alone. "Sir Edmund," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. He was standing close enough that she could see the open notebook in his hand, the pages dense with notation, and the date at the top of the first relevant page, which was the 7th of April, 1811, which was before her separation, and before the deed, and before everything. He said, "I am sorry I did not do this sooner." She thought about what to say. There were things she could say that would be generous and gracious, and would absolve him neatly. She said, instead, "Yes, he received this without flinching." Something in the set of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, something more serious and more permanent. He said, "I should like to call tomorrow, if you will permit it, to discuss several things." He paused, and the pause held more than one meaning after the last 2 words. She looked at him. She looked at the notebook in his hand. She thought of the room she had entered tonight expecting nothing, and of the way he had crossed it with that quality of direction that had nothing tentative in it. "You may call," she said. He closed the notebook. He did not replace it in his breast pocket. He held it a moment, considering it, and then he looked up at her and said, "The notes will go to your solicitor, Mr. Thorne, is it?" Mrs. Penhaligon mentioned him. He had already spoken to Mrs. Brawl. Penhaligon. She had not known that either. She said, "Mr. Thorne?" "Yes." She looked at his face. She had been careful for 3 years, meticulous and controlled and entirely alone in the management of her caution, and she was tired of it in a way she had not permitted herself to feel until this exact moment. Standing in the Bath Assembly Rooms in the cream muslin gown, she had retrimmed herself. With a man who had crossed a room on her behalf and said 9 words in a voice that did not require any room to be quieter than it already was. Behind them, at the far end of the room, the natural mathematics of a crowd were redistributing attention and meaning. Lady Alderton had sat down, which was not something Cecily had ever seen her do in a public setting, unless she chose to. Sir Gerald was speaking in a low, urgent voice to someone she could not see. Miss Lavinia Rowe stood with her diamonds and her white satin, and a particular expression that Cecily recognized as the expression of a young woman recalibrating the terms of a situation. None of this was triumph. Cecily did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more final than triumph, the specific relief of a weight she had not been certain she could continue to carry, simply being at last set down. He walked her into Mrs. Boss. Penhaligon, who was beaming in the way of a woman who has been waiting patiently for the correct outcome. Edmund stayed long enough to exchange the minimum necessary conversation, which was enough conversation that the room had time to see it happen, which was not an accident. He left at 9. He called the following morning at 10. He was shown into Aunt Marjorie's sitting room, where fire had been made against the February cold, and Cecily was sitting in the good chair near the window, with her hands folded in her lap in the composed way she had, and her hair done rather more carefully than was strictly necessary for a morning at home, which she had told herself was coincidence. He sat down across from her. He set the notebook on the side table between them, and a letter beside it which she would later understand was from Mr. Thorne, already begun. She looked at both objects. Why? The notebook was well used, its cover dark with handling, the binding cracked in 2 places. A working notebook, not a formal one, the kind a man used habitually, not ceremoniously. She thought of how she had seen it in the lending library, open in his hand while he stood in front of the science shelves, and of how she had not known then what it contained, and of how it now sat on her aunt's side table between them as if it had always been intended to end up here. He said without preamble, "I should tell you something about my wife." He said it in the way he said most things, plainly and without performance. "I lost her in 1811, a few months after I made those notes, as it happens. I mention it because it bears on why I said nothing. For as long as I said nothing, I had persuaded myself that a man who has just failed the person he most needed not to fail does not have the authority to speak into other people's marriages. I was wrong. I persuaded myself of a great many things, and I was wrong about most of them." He stopped. He looked at the fire. She said, "I am sorry about your wife." "Thank you." He looked back at her. She would have said I was being an idiot incidentally about the notes. She had a talent for naming idiocy, precisely. Something shifted in Cecily's chest. Not the cold, something else. "I intend to be less idiotic going forward," he said. "With some things in particular." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she had stopped trying to name, and was simply going to have to accept as the expression of Edmund. A physician who crossed rooms when he had made up his mind and spoke in level declarative sentences, and had carried her exoneration in his breast pocket for 3 years, and had finally, at considerable cost to his professional discretion and his social ease, produced it in a public room because he had watched her slide a misplaced card back into its proper place and arrived at the last piece of information he required. She said, "That seems on the whole advisable." He stayed 2 hours. Aunt Marjorie appeared at the 40-minute mark, accepted tea and a brief introduction, and withdrew again with a discretion that suggested she had been listening from the hall and approved. By the time February turned to March and the bath season began its gradual loosening into the milder air of spring, Mr. Fenty. Thorne had received Edmund's notes and had written 2 letters of consequence, and she had received, from a solicitor acting on her behalf, a formal acknowledgment of certain matters relating to her former marriage that would, over the following months, do the slow and procedural work of correcting what had been done. It was not rapid. The machinery of correction moved the way the machinery of damage had moved. A gear at a time, a season at a time, it moved. Edmund called every 3rd day through March. He called every other day in April. In late April, standing in Aunt Marjorie's small garden where the first wallflowers had appeared between the stone paving, he said something that he had been working toward for approximately 6 weeks, with an obliqueness that was, for a man of his directness, something she had chosen to find endearing rather than maddening. She said yes. Before he finished the sentence, he stopped. He looked at her. She said, "You were going to ask Sir Edmund. I am answering." The expression that passed across his face then was the one she had been cataloging since January, and had not been able to name, and she understood now that it was this: a man arriving somewhere he had not been certain he would be permitted to go. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his coat, a habit she had watched 100 times, but he did not produce the notebook this time. He simply pressed his hand to the pocket for a moment, the gesture of a man checking that something is where he left it, and let his hand fall. She took his arm. The wallflowers smelled clean and cold and alive in the April air. Above them, the bath stone of the terrace was golden. In the afternoon light, she was not barren. She had known this, in the particular way one knows something that one has not been given permission to say for 3 years. She had held it in the quiet part of herself, where she put the things she could not afford to look at directly. And she had waited. The notes existed. The notes had always existed. The fault had never been hers. Spring moved into the garden without ceremony. The fire in the sitting room burned low, and was made up again and burned low again over the months that followed, and in the evenings Edmund would read and she would read, and Aunt Marjorie would fall asleep with her knitting in the good chair. And the small leather notebook that had lived for so long in the breast pocket of a physician's coat sat in a drawer in Mr. Thorne's office in the town, its work done, its pages finally settled. If the story moved you, take a moment to leave your thoughts. Every story is built for the person who stayed until the end. In the second winter of their marriage, on an evening in December when snow came down past the windows and soft, steady curtains and the fire was very warm and the room was very quiet, Edmund looked up from his reading, and she looked up from hers, and they sat like that for a moment, looking at each other across the hearthrug. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing required, which was itself the thing she had not known to want. That specific quality of silence that is not absence but the opposite of it, a room so fully inhabited that it needed no decoration. He put down his book. He crossed the hearthrug. He sat beside her, close, his shoulder against hers, and looked at the fire. On the mantelpiece above it, among the winter greenery, stood a small portrait miniature, in a plain frame, dark-haired, and younger than his memory of her. He had put it there in November. She had not asked him to explain it, and he had not explained it, and it was simply there, among the evergreen. Her predecessor in this house, the woman who would have named his idiocy precisely, and who had, as it turned out, been right about him all along. The snow fell. The fire held. Cecily leaned her head against his shoulder, and the cold that had lived in her chest for 3 years, the cold she had carried since a man stood at his study window and spoke to the glass rather than to her, and told her she was the deficiency, loosened its last purchase and was gone. The fire settled, the snow continued falling, soft and without urgency, as if it too had no further argument to make.